In a lot of settings, the concept of kids getting to play is considered entirely positive. There are play dates to help them socialize. They play make-believe to grow their imaginations. They play sports. They play tuba. But playing video games, that gets all controversial, where the arguments tend to go in two directions. Either that gaming is mostly bad for you, it's addictive, it is sedentary, and it is not especially educational. But others say, oh, really, if you think that, then you don't know how far games have come, how socially productive they can be, how some research shows that there are benefits to a variety of cognitive skills, actually making gamers in some ways smarter than everybody else. So which is it? Well, that sounds like the makings of a debate, so let's have it. Yes or no to this statement: video games will make us smarter. I'm John Donvan. I stand between two teams of two experts in the topic who will argue for and against the motion. As always, our debate will go in 3 rounds, and then our live audience here in New York will vote to choose the winner. And if all goes well, civil discourse will also win here tonight. I want to ask you to now go to the keypads at your seats and tell us where you stand on this motion as you come in off the street. If you pick them up, you'll see a bunch of keys on it, but right now you only need to pay attention to keys numbers 1, 2, and 3. Take a look at the motion. Video games will make us smarter. If you agree with this motion right now, push number 1. If you disagree, it's number 2. And if you're undecided, it's number 3. The motion again, video games will make us smarter. Let's meet our debaters. Please first, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Daphne Bavalier. Hi, Daphne. You're a professor of cognitive neuroscience at the University of Geneva, a co-founding advisor to Akili Interactive. You have a great TED Talk that I highly recommend. You are a brain researcher, and your research does suggest that video games, games like Call of Duty, actually can have lasting cognitive benefits. So knowing all of that, does that mean that you yourself are a gamer?
Funny you should ask, John, right? I hope I'm not going to disappoint too many of you, but I'm really not a gamer. And I must share, it's worse than that. When I come back home, and I used to have adolescents at home, I had this gut feeling finding one of my kids in front of the console and thinking, oh God, don't you have something better to do? And
you feel better now that you've done all the research that tells you it was okay?
We'll get to that, yeah.
Oh, we'll get to that, okay. That's a great answer. Tell us, please, who your partner is.
So my partner is Asi Burak, is one of the fierce leader of Game for Change.
Let me explain what that is. Welcome, Asi Burak. That's right. As Daphne said, you're chairman of Games for Change. You're also CEO of Power Play, one of the creators of a game called Peacemaker. And this was is a strategy game in which players can choose to play either the leader of Israel or the leader of the Palestinian Authority, and they try to figure out what happens between. We've had some interesting things happen on this stage between those two sides. But does anybody playing this game actually win?
So we thought about it a lot, and we decided the game is going to be winnable. You can win the game, although it's very frustrating at the beginning, so many players ask the same question of us.
But victory is...
Can we win this game?
Peace is possible.
It is possible. It was a decision we made, yeah.
Okay, let's hope the reality translates to that someday, and we can have that debate. Thanks very much. Again, the team arguing for the motion. And now let's meet the team arguing against the motion. Please welcome first Elias Aboujaoude. Elias, hi, you are a professor of psychiatry and director of the Obsessive Compulsive Disorder Clinic and the Impulse Control Disorders Clinic at Stanford. You wrote a book called Virtually You, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality, in which you do sound a strong note of caution about the digital world. Given your point of view and your expertise on this, do you consciously limit your time spent online?
I do, when I'm conscious of it.
So you might lose track.
I might lose track.
And not stand up for a long, long time. Okay, and please tell us, please, who your partner is.
I'm happy to introduce Dr. Walter Booth, Associate Professor of Psychology at Florida State University.
Ladies and gentlemen, Walter Wally Booth. You've asked us to call us Wally, so we will move forward that way. You are indeed a professor of psychology at Florida State. You direct its attention and training lab. Your research, kind of the mirror, same field as your opponent Daphne, you investigate the effects of video games on cognition, some of it specifically on cognition and aging. At the moment, you don't think that video games do much to improve brain function. Is there anything that does?
Well, there's one activity right now with fairly good support behind it that actually improves brain function. Unfortunately, no one wants to do it, aerobic exercise.
Aerobic exercise, I can see everybody in the whole hall here standing up now doing jumping jacks. Not really. The team arguing against the motion, ladies and gentlemen. And that motion is video games will make us smarter. As I said, we go in 3 rounds. We're going to move directly into round 1. The motion, video games will make us smarter. Here making his argument in support of the motion, and you can make your way to the lectern. Asi Burak, chairman of Games for Change and co-author of the book Power Play, How Video Games Can Save the World. Ladies and gentlemen, Asi Burak.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to argue today for something I'm very passionate about, which is the power of video games for good. And I want to start with a personal story. Actually, you helped me by setting up the Peacemaker story. I came from Israel 12 years ago, and I lived in the United States since then. I came to Carnegie Mellon, and I came after serving in the Israeli army for 5 years. I was a captain in the Israeli army. And the first project I took upon myself, out of my passion for design and technology, is to make a game about the Middle East. So my army experience certainly helped and inspired that choice. And together with a group of students at Carnegie Mellon, we made a game that simulates the Middle East conflict in a very realistic way. We actually used real-world footage in the game. And it was a lot about different perspectives because you could actually play either side. It was also about our goal to generate empathy. The idea that if someone would play the other side, he would understand better the situation. The game made quite a splash because it was 2007. The perception around video games was even more negative than today. And it was before Facebook, before mobile games, the picture of the gamer in the basement eating pizza. And we made a game about peace, you know, that you could actually reach a peaceful solution. And we got a lot of coverage in the media, anywhere you can think of. We got a lot of community support and NGOs that embraced the game. And we had politicians that played it and lost in 5 minutes. And something that surprised us through the process was that we started hearing the same quote over and over again. And the quote was, "I played your game for 2 hours, and now I understand the Middle East conflict better than watching the news for 2 years." Okay, so I repeat. I played your game for 2 hours, and I understand the Middle East conflict better than watching the news or reading newspapers for 2 years. Kept hearing the same exact quote from different people, whether they're in Israel, the West Bank, or America. And we started to try to understand. That wasn't necessarily our goal. Our goal was about perspectives and understanding. So we started to try to understand how did it happen. And we did our own research. We partnered with others that did research in Carnegie Mellon and outside. And we started to understand that where the game succeeded, in which traditional media fails, is connecting the dots for people. When we watch those hours and hours about the Middle East on TV, or about Iraq, for that matter, or about Afghanistan, we are watching a stream of linear events. We're very passive, and those events are isolated, and they don't necessarily come together to a big picture. What happened with Peacemaker was that you made the decisions. You are the leader, you are in the position of power, you take an action, you see the consequence. You start to understand the deep loops of cause and effect. But it's not only about what you do, it's also about the other stakeholders in the conflict. So people didn't only get smarter, they actually got an understanding of a very complex issue through Peacemaker. That changed my career made me invest much more in this and eventually get to Games for Change and see games that improve all kinds of things, and I hope we'll talk about them today. Which brings me to, from this story, to frame the debate as we, Daphne and I, see it. This is not a debate that we want to do around all games makes us smarter. We are great believers in the power of design and the purpose. It's not that, like the flyer that you see here, each kid that is going to play Space Invaders is going to become Einstein. That's not our debate. We want to argue that video games are an incredible learning tool with tons of potential. This is what we're basically saying. I want to unpack the learning potential for a second. Number one, better understanding of complex issues and complex systems. This is what we did with Peacemaker at the time. Number two is make players, especially young players, better equipped for the 21st century playfield. And we're talking about 21st century skills, things like entrepreneurship, collaboration, problem solving, system thinking. Games are great in fostering some of those skills. Number three, making smarter decisions about our life. And here, Daphne and I will talk about things beyond education, because when you make smarter decisions about your life and health, you can actually prevent some medical conditions or fight some medical conditions, and maybe even live longer. We're not going to ignore risks. Daphne and I will be the first to admit that are risks, especially if you play video games in excess, but we want to also talk about ways to address it. You know, we don't want to ignore it. We want to, find better ways to deal with it. And what my teammate Daphne will do in her statement coming after me is to dive even deeper into her research and research by others and give you the evidence. You know, I made some broad claims here, and we'll get deeper into the evidence later. In summary, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to vote yes for this motion. I want you to vote yes, that games are a great learning tool with tons of potential. In that sense, they have the potential to make us smarter. Thank you.
Thank you, Asi Burak. And that's the motion right there. Video games will make us smarter. And here to make his opening statement against the motion, and you can make your way to the lectern, Elias Aboujaoude, clinical professor of psychiatry and director of the Obsessive Compulsive Disorder Clinic at the Stanford University School of Medicine. Ladies and gentlemen, Elias Aboujaoude.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's hard to talk about psychological damages from technology without sounding seriously behind the times. After all, when TV first came around, people thought it would spell the end of civilization. Even before TV, when movies, the radio, novels in the 18th century first happened, there were naysayers who predicted worst possible scenario outcomes. But I do think that the internet and related technologies are different. Video games talk back to you. They reward you, they punish you. They're much more lifelike, especially if you consider something like virtual reality. And for that reason, they're easier to confuse with life itself and easier to get lost in and hooked on than some older technologies, perhaps. We know quite a bit more now than we did when the term internet addiction was first coined almost 20 years ago now. We know that these technologies can operate on the same pathways in the brain as substances of abuse and some addictive behaviors like gambling. We know that for some people, tolerance can set in, which is the need to play more and more of the same game to achieve the same kind of effect, or withdrawal, which is this uncomfortable psychological, sometimes physical state that a person feels when they try to log off. We know that for some individuals, their attachment to the virtual world can be so intense as to really interfere negatively in other crucial aspects of their lives, socializing, relationships, academic performance, job performance, etc. Because of all this data, over a couple of decades now, the American Psychiatric Association has included internet gaming disorder as a condition for further research in its last edition of the the DSM. The American Academy of Pediatrics also issued an advisory strictly curtailing and limiting the time that kids spend online. Now, there are many definitions for intelligence, the topic of our debate tonight, but I think we can all agree that intimately linked to intelligence, intimately linked to cognition, are activities and functions such as attention, reading, writing, memory, and in all these spheres, technology has had an impact that's not necessarily positive. When it comes to attention, there are higher rates of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder being diagnosed, and a corollary to that is a huge increase in the number of prescriptions for stimulants that are being given by psychiatrists and mental health professionals. And people have connected that to the pervasiveness of some of the digital technologies that we're talking about. You might expect high rates of ADHD among kids and adolescents, but we see it in adults as well. I work in my practice with a lot of professionals, people that you would expect to be comfortable with dense, deep texts, lawyers, professors, etc. And they tell me that they have lost patience for complexity. And indeed, it's hard to go from focusing for 20 seconds on a web page to reading War and Peace. So attention has been impacted. So has writing. We write online and in our texting platforms in a way that's very different from the language that we learn to write. Somehow we think that we can condense a complicated argument into a 140-character tweet, for instance. The contractions we use, the bitmojis, emojis, endlessly fascinating to linguists. However, they can interfere with language's purpose to communicate with precision and with nuance specific states of mind and specific facts. Reading has been similarly transformed. Eye tracking experiments show that we very rarely actually read a web page in its entirety. Instead, we take it in a giant F shape where we look at the top horizontal band, another horizontal band slightly lower, and the left spine. Again, we don't read a web page in its entirety. In fact, if you were reading an online transcript of this speech I'm giving, the chances are you would have logged off a while ago. So our reading patterns are not consistent with deep immersion in online content. Memory has been similarly transformed. I work with medical students who constantly ask me, without any hint of irony, why is it that they have to memorize anything anymore when whatever nugget of information they're after, a treatment algorithm, a complicated medication name, dosage range, it's never further away than a click of a button on their cell phone. So whether it's attention, memory, writing, reading, all these things have been transformed, which is why when a statement such as the one we're debating tonight, that video games are actually making us more intelligent, for us to support a statement like that, given this larger cognitive atmosphere and environment that we're functioning in, for us to support a statement like that, the quality of the research has to be beyond reproach because there's so much at stake. And simply, the studies aren't there yet. They're too small, too short-term, too non-representative of the totality of humanity currently online for this statement to be accurate. So for that reason, I urge you to vote no on the motion. I also urge you to consider the opportunity cost. The activities that we are not spending time on as we spend hours upon hours playing video games. And ask yourselves whether these activities are not also important for our intelligence and for being well-rounded, well-grounded human beings. I urge you to vote no on the motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elias Aboujaoude. And a reminder of what's going on. We are halfway through the opening round of this Intelligence Squared US debate. I'm John Donvan. We have 4 debaters, 2 teams of 2, fighting it out over this motion: video games will make us smarter. You've heard the first 2 opening statements, and now on to the third. Here to debate in support of the motion, Daphne Bavalier, a professor at the University of Geneva, where she directs a cognitive neuroscience research team. Ladies and gentlemen, Daphne Bavalier.
I'm glad to see so many of you tonight. So you heard, I'm not a gamer. Video games have actually earned my respect in the context of my work as a scientist. I'm studying brain plasticity and learning. That is, I'm studying how the brain adapts and reorganizes in the face of changes in experience. For a very long time, I've actually been working with people that are born deaf and looking at how the lack of audition changes the way that the brain develops. One of the main findings from that work is that there are deep changes in how attention works. Now, it's in this context that a young undergraduate, Sean Green, and myself made a chance discovery. What happened is that we had a number of computerized tests of attention in the lab, and we noticed that Sean and his friends were really, really good at those tests. These are kind of computerized Where's Waldo tests. And we couldn't really understand it for a while. And as it happens, we realized that Sean and his friends were all part of the same video game club at the University of Rochester here in upstate New York. It was in year 2000. So those guys were meeting 3 or 4 times a week to play first-person or third-person shooter game, Call of Duty, Medal of Honor, Team Fortress, Unreal Tournament. And we wondered, could it be the case that playing such mind-numbing games had such profound effects on something we all value, which is attentional control, this ability that we have to focus on the task at hand and to ignore sources of distraction. So this really set up 17 years of research. 17 years of research I'm trying to summarize for you in 3 minutes. And so because we have 17 years of research, we can actually not cherry pick studies here and there, but rather look at all of them together. The first finding that I want to report is that when we look at those people that decide to play those action games versus people that don't play, we do see benefits in cognition. We do see benefits in attentional control like Sean and his friends show. These are moderate effect sizes that are quite significant. Now, it's nice, but it's not really what we are after. What we are after, because I'm interested in brain plasticity and learning, is asking, can I take any of you here, like a young adult, force you to play an action video game and change your attentional control for the better? So this is actually where randomized control studies come in, and you're going to hear more, I'm sure, from my colleague Wally Boot. Here, in the case of this study, we have 17 years of studies from our lab and lab of others, so that's more than 2,000 participants. Some participants were asked to play those action video games. Other participants were asked to play control game, also entertainment games, like social simulation games. And what we showed is that those individuals that are asked to play the action game improve more in their cognition than those asked to play the control game. They were changed again in attentional control for the better. Now, I know some of you in the audience are going to say, oh boy, like, what kind of news are you giving us? What do I tell my kids if they come to me and say, look, Mom and Dad, Professor Bavalier said I can play as much as I want because it's good for my brains. So I have good news for you, those of you parents. What you should tell your kid is to go and read the methods section of our papers. Okay, granted, it's a little bit difficult, but really learning with video games is not different than learning with any other media. That means small distributed practice. So what we recommend to get the effects that we see is about 30 minutes per day, 4 to 5 days a week for a period of about 10 to 12 weeks. And this way you can see durable changes that are still there like a few months later. So no reason for binging. And in fact, there is even data in the literature that suggests that massing practice with video games, like with any learning, is counterproductive. Now, I'd like to just close by making you realize I just took a very, very deep dive into my area of research. But there is many other researchers that are working on how we can leverage the power of video games for the better with application, either clinical application insights or educational application insights. There's new journals like Game for Health that have been created. There's a lot of American campuses that are creating a new gaming department where the best and the brightest students are actually flocking. And we need that because, as Asi said, designing games for change, for impact, is actually a difficult challenge. And so in this sense that Asi and I want tonight to put forward to you the motion that games have an amazing potential as a learning tools. We shouldn't turn our back on the problems, but we should certainly leverage the media for what it has to offer in terms of being a facilitator of teaching and learning, a preparation for future learning, some of my colleagues like to say. And that it's in this sense that video games will make us smarter. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Daphne Bavalier. And we have one more debater to go in the opening round, now making his way to the lectern. Wally Boot, he is an associate professor of psychology at Florida State University and director of its Attention and Training Lab. Ladies and gentlemen, Wally Boot.
Thank you. So we like to think and often readily believe that the things we enjoy are good for us. Chocolate? Sure, I could believe that. Red wine? Even better. And now it's a popular notion that video games are good for us. They can improve our perceptual and cognitive abilities in fundamental and meaningful ways. Consumers spend millions of dollars each year on brain-training video games. Why? Because they're ready to believe that the games will make them smarter, and companies are all too happy to capitalize on this belief. But maybe they're right. Maybe the games can make us smarter. Maybe the companies can make good on the promise of reversing age-related cognitive decline. But what does the evidence show? Are they right? In 2014, a group of over 70 scientists with expertise in learning, skill acquisition, and neuroscience published a consensus statement led by teams at Stanford and the Max Planck Institute. This consensus statement concluded that brain games do not provide a scientifically grounded way to improve cognitive functioning or to reverse cognitive decline associated with aging. So, in a sense, video games do not make us smarter. This consensus is consistent with over a century of research on how we learn. Video game effects depend on the assumption of broad transfer of training, that training on one task, in this case a video game, can improve your performance of other tasks that you were not trained on. This is consistent with the now outdated notion that Latin training can improve your performance of other subjects. However, the most consistent pattern in the scientific literature is that this simply isn't the case. Training improves your performance of the tasks that you were trained on, and perhaps very similar tasks, but benefits do not generalize beyond that, and it's unclear why video games would be an exception to this general rule. Given the lack of compelling evidence for broad training benefits, it's not surprising that the Federal Trade Commission has been investigating the claims of brain game companies. Lumosity, one of the biggest brain training video game companies in the world and one of the most heavily marketed, was recently fined $50 million for deceptive advertising. The FTC did not find compelling evidence that their games, and could support their claims that their games could make you smarter, can improve your cognition, to make you a better athlete. They didn't find evidence for that, or can improve your performance at school or at work. Some of these companies, but not all, cite peer-reviewed studies to support their claims. The Stanford and the Max Planck teams did not find this evidence convincing, nor did the FTC. When viewing the websites of these companies, it's important to consider not just the number of studies they cite, but the quality of those studies as well, and what can be concluded from certain study designs. So what evidence do the video game proponents cite to support their claims? Some studies compare the cognitive abilities of gamers to non-gamers and conclude that video games make you smarter. Well, maybe, but that's not convincing evidence. It's like comparing basketball players to non-basketball players and concluding that basketball makes you taller. Taller people are more likely to play basketball, just as people with very good perceptual and cognitive abilities may be drawn to the games that utilize those abilities. Gameplay doesn't necessarily cause these superior abilities, it's a consequence of them. To conclude that gameplay causes improved cognitive abilities, intervention studies that randomly assign people to either receive video game training or not are necessary. Recently, a number of colleagues and I conducted a comprehensive review of the evidence that interventions, including interventions involving commercial and custom video games, can improve cognition. What we found in general was that the evidence was inconsistent, but more importantly, what we found was that studies often utilized inappropriate control groups, inappropriate reporting practices, and also inappropriate statistical approaches that all biased results in favor of finding video game effects. Many studies did not adequately control for placebo effects. A placebo effect is an improvement not due to the treatment itself, but because one expects to improve after receiving some kind of treatment. Some of the studies that we looked at compared video game training to a group that did nothing. Doing nothing is unlikely to generate any expectation of improvement. It would be like being in a drug trial and being randomly assigned to a group that didn't receive a drug. Would you expect to improve? Most likely not. Other studies use control groups that are much better. For example, the control groups used in action video games. This literature looks at action video games versus an active control group, a control group that does something. Typically, the control group that does something does Tetris training. What our research has shown is that people actually expect very little from Tetris training compared to fast-paced, attentionally demanding action video games. This is another case where expectations differ between the experimental and the control group, and any difference there could equally be plausibly caused by a placebo effect when expectations match the outcomes. People, including myself, enjoy playing video games. Are there benefits beyond that? I'm going to ask for your vote. I'm going to ask you to vote no. I'm going to ask you to be skeptical of companies selling products to improve cognition. I'm going to ask you to be skeptical of effects that are so fundamentally different from how we know learning works. I'm going to ask you to be skeptical and demand better evidence and also better quality studies before concluding that video games can improve IQ or any other abilities. Just as we should be skeptical of get-rich-quick schemes, I also please urge you to ask you to be skeptical of get-smart-quick schemes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali Boot. And that concludes round one of this Intelligence Squared US debate, where our motion is video games will make us smarter. Before we move on to round two, we want to learn a little bit more about you, our audience. And so I want to ask you a series of questions about yourselves. They're very easy. If you go to the keypads at your seat, I'll ask you some questions and you can push buttons to give the answers. The first one is we would like to know what age range you fall into. I won't read them out unless somebody needs to hear. Actually, I will. Number one, less than 18. If you're 18 to 30, push number 2. If you're 30 to 45, push number 3. If you're 45 to 65, push number 4. If you're greater than 65, push number 5. If you're greater than 105, please stand up and take a bow. Next question, gender. 1 for male, 2 for female. Question number 3, how often do you play video games? Push number 1 for every day, daily. Number 2 for a few times a week. Number 3, a few times a month. Number 4, rarely. Number 5 is never. And the last one, what is your preferred gaming platform? Number 1 for a console. Number 2 for a desktop computer or laptop computer. Number 3 for phone. Number 4 for tablet. Number 5 for other handheld gaming system. Number 6 for none. Okay, so we'll show the results of those a little bit later on in about 20 minutes or so as we're moving forward. Now we move on to round 2, and in round 2, the debaters address one another directly, and they take questions from me and from you, our live audience here in New York. The motion is video games will make us smarter. The team arguing for the motion, Asi Burak and Daphne Bavalier, have described games as an incredible learning tool with tons of potential, clearly a power for good. They talk about the ability of games to generate empathy, to teach people about reality by connecting the dots. Daphne also talked about her own research, which suggests, she says strongly, that gamers become actually superior to everyone else in certain forms of truly focused intentions. They are not, and nobody in this debate is taking a dogmatic position. They're not saying there's no such thing as harm caused by games, but they say that the potential is amazing, should be celebrated, should be embraced, and we should push forward. They also say that there have been many, many medium that learning on video games is not different from learning on any other media. The team arguing against the motion, Walter Boot and Elias Aboujaoude, they actually say that video games are different, that they're not like other media, that they are easier to confuse with life itself because they talk back to you. They talk about problems that develop, addiction, withdrawal, other symptoms of addiction such as tolerance. They point to the fact that the psychiatric profession is considering launching a diagnosis called internet gaming disorder. They talk about the impact, the negative impact, they say, correlated with gaming on things like just basic reading and writing, things that take a deep immersion in content, a skill that they say is being lost broadly across the society. But most importantly, they say that the studies being cited by their opponents, broadly speaking, not a direct attack on Daphne's work, but broadly speaking, do not support this great enthusiasm that the team arguing for this side is arguing. They also make the case that some charlatan companies are making money off of this expectation. We're not going to ask this side to defend that. They're not here to have to defend those companies. And so I want to make that clear that we're going to move away. Unless you're raising your hand, maybe you want to?
Well,
Daphne?
so our research has been used by some of these companies as saying, look, video games are great for you. So there's two things. Already I need to correct you because I think it's really important. We're here to have an intelligent debate. What I told you about is not all video games. In fact, in our training study, as Wally mentioned, we contrast those action video games to other commercially available video games. Sometimes we have used Tetris, but sometimes we have used Restaurant Empire. Other times we have used social simulation games. We actually used a variety of them. I'm happy to tell you more. This already shows that different games will have different impact. We're not expecting, broadly speaking, to see that all video games will have an impact. Then I'm with Wally. I actually signed the Stanford consensus letter because there's been abuse using our research to advance an agenda that was not validated by research. I'm working now at Inkili Interactive. I'm one of their founder and scientific advisor. What we're trying to do to put some clarity is to go for FDA approval. This is getting the bar really high so that we don't get into this issue of the FTC regulating the industry. We need to be clearly having done all of the registered randomized controlled trial before we can say this video game has an impact and here it's clinical efficacy.
Okay, so you took things in a direction I wasn't actually going to take it, but since you did, I want to let your opponents respond to it, and I'll go to Wally Boot to respond to what you just heard.
No, I completely agree with Daphne. We need these registered clinical trials, we need pre-registration, we need higher standards before we can conclude that video games make us smarter. And my point is that we aren't there yet. We don't have those registered clinical trials. We don't have pre-registration. I don't think we have control groups that do a good enough job of controlling for expectations and other confounds and demand characteristics and all these other types of things. So I completely agree.
Oh, when the two sides completely agree, we all have to go home for the night. So good night, everybody. No, but there are fault lines in this argument, and one of them has to do with the sense, again, when I say this is a nuanced conversation and nobody's taking a dogmatic position, the fact is the side arguing for the motion is enormously enthusiastic about the potential. The side arguing against the motion is worried, concerned, and raising red flags, and I think that that's where the fault line is going to be. It's about the preponderance of the dynamic here. So I want to go back to Asi Burak. When you opened, you talked about the ability of games to really to teach people about the real world. And I hear skepticism from your opponents about that, you know, in this, we're talking about two things here. We're talking about neuroscience, what's happening in the brain as measured through these experiments. But we're also talking in a more social way about the impact of these games on people's behavior out in the world.
Right. So this is important because I want also to exclude myself from the brain games camp, because Peacemaker and other games I'll talk about today, they're not brain games in that sense that they train the brain. They're just really good learning tools.
But what I found interesting your opponents say is that the problem with games is that they make, how did they put it? They make it easier to confuse the game with life itself, and it sounds like you're all gung-ho for that.
Yeah, I actually think it's a great thing that they can simulate life itself. So in a sense, this is something that I want to introduce into the discussion. Games are different than most traditional media by being anchored around systems, okay? Most traditional media is anchored around stories. Theater, film, books, etc. There are linear stories with a beginning, middle, and end. Games are systems with rules. So what we did with our game Peacemaker and other projects is we took a system, we claimed that the Middle East has logic, at large, and that different stakeholders have different agendas, and we can make a simple model that will be simple enough to be convincing for players to understand the complexity. Now, I can do the same about physics. I can take any system in the world, and there are systems all around us, and do the same simulation. Again, the power of design here is important because not everybody can do it.
Let me take this to Elias Aboujaoude. So your opponent saying that you can really learn things in 2 hours in a game that really do tell you things about the real world, which to me seems to be walking right into your argument that that's confusing reality in a game.
Right. I mean, again, the more lifelike games are, the easier it is to confuse them with reality. I think it's wonderful that there are certain applications that can be pro-peace, but I think a lot more people go online in general and go to video games in particular to play games that are more violent, more aggressive in nature. And there's intriguing evidence now that aggression and violence in video games can potentially lead to future offline aggression.
I want to come back to that observation, but in passing, are you conceding Asi's point that it's possible to create a world where the games are all good and teaching positive things? Because that's kind of their core argument.
I would contest that games can be predominantly peaceful and predominantly encourage the more positive aspects of society and of our personality. And the reason for that is our experience with the internet in general. The anonymity of the experience, the lack of any structural hierarchy and accountability makes it the perfect medium for us to express less positive aspects of personality, whether it's aggression, narcissism, impulsivity. Look at how easy it is for people to get radicalized online. People don't go online to become more moderate. They go online and end up consciously or unconsciously breaking down into more extreme groups. So I want to believe that the internet and video games can make for a more peaceful world, but our experience 20 years into the internet revolution does not support that, supports the contrary.
I'll come back to Asi one more time, and then I want to bring Daphne into the conversation again. But Asi, so is your experience that people are lining up to play a game to make peace in the Middle East?
Much more.
Or do you have to kind of trick them into playing?
No, much more. I mean, the interesting thing is that 10 years ago, when I needed to fight that fight for video games for social cause, it was a very, very tough fight. You know, when we introduced the idea of Peacemaker to the faculty at Carnegie Mellon so they could support us, it was a nutty idea, right? Completely crazy. Today, I mean, people like me that really make games and play games and look at the market, it's not true that most games are violent. It's just not true. I mean, with the expansion of mobile games and Facebook games, there are so many games that are about building environments. Look at Minecraft, one of the biggest successes in video games in recent history. It's a game about building blocks. It's a game about building creative worlds and environments. One of the other big successes of video games in history, The Sims or SimCity. Mm-hmm. These are games that have nothing to do with violence or have nothing to do with conflict or competition. So I don't know if everybody will go and play Peacemaker, but I know that many people will go and play games that build environments.
Let me ask Wally Boot, why doesn't that optimism on your opponent's side wash over you like a refreshing wave?
Well, I think we're talking about two things: games to teach specific skills, and I think that's consistent with what we know about how learning works. We can teach you specific things, we can gamify something, but really, I think there's a tension between what Asi is saying, what Daphne is saying, which is, can these things improve your cognitive abilities in a very general way so that you're just now smarter, or you have better attention, or you have other kind of advantages. And I think there's I would definitely say games, just like any other thing, like a good documentary could teach you things, or a book can teach you things, games can teach you things. Does that improve your IQ? Does that improve your ability to solve novel problems? I think that's where we come down.
Fair question. I'd like to take it to Daphne. What about the idea of these skills that you're establishing superiority in certain kinds of tension, and nobody's really challenging that. I mean, your work has been replicated, it's replicable. But your opponents are saying those skills aren't really transferable in any meaningful way that we know of yet, but that so far they're not.
So I'll respond to that question, but before I want to clarify something, because I think it's really, really important given how much confusion there is out there. Different video games have different effect. Different use of technology have different effect. And this to come back to Elias' notion about different type of internet use. We're not going to get the same effect of using, like, Facebook versus doing search and reading Wikipedia. It's like different effect. We need to be very specific. Brain plasticity is something that Wally was saying is very specific. If there is one thing we know in learning, is that it's indeed extremely hard to get transfer. I can take any of you here, force you to learn a task, you're going to be better at that task. The issue is, does it transfer to anything else than that very task? And that's the challenge in the field that Wally and I are trying to address. There are right now 4 different types of intervention that seem to give more transfer, not absolute transfer. Like, it's not, I didn't tell you that all of cognition change. I told you that some aspect of cognition change. These 4 different activities are exercise, that was mentioned by Elias earlier on, playing action video games that I mentioned, learning to play a musical instrument, listening to music doesn't do it, and mind-brain meditation techniques. These are the 4 that are the most promising, that are being looked and studied really extensively to look at whether you don't just become better at playing action video games, but if I ask you to actually now train as a laparoscopic surgeon, that they are actually transferable skills. I'm taking that example because totally in parallel of our work, there's a team at Beth Israel around 2004, 2005 that came across the fact that they're young surgeons that were video game players, and especially action video game players, were much better in surgery simulators than the most seasoned surgeons in the team. They were much better in the sense that they were performing the surgery faster and they didn't make more errors. That translates into less time in the operating room for the patients and actually a benefit for everybody.
Let me take that point to Elias Aboujaoude. So these success stories, you're not refuting the facts. How do they fit into your argument?
Absolutely. I'm not refuting individual success stories. Absolutely not. I think what we're debating here is a much more general motion than that, which is that video games are making us more intelligent. I'm not focusing on a specific intervention. I agree with Daphne, especially when it comes to virtual reality and surgical training, etc. But video games as a family of activities certainly don't have the data and the science to support a blanket statement that they are making us more intelligent. To the contrary, there's a lot more data that suggests the opposite, and not just in terms of impacting intelligence negatively, but also in terms of feeding some personality traits that have nothing to do with intelligence, but that aren't so positive.
Asi, what about that? So your opponent, Elias's real argument is that the success stories are real, but the broader statement that this is a great direction to be moving in is unproven. And he also raises flags about, earlier in his opening statement, he raised flags about things like people really losing the ability to sit and read and losing the ability to sit and write at length.
So I have a quick story that I think relates to that. Sandra Day O'Connor, Supreme Court Justice, okay, 83 years old. Many people don't know it, unfortunately, because part of my job is that more people will know the story, is that her first project after retiring from the Supreme Court was a video game project. It's called iCivics, and you can play those games online. Over 7 years, the NGO that she started made 19 games to teach civic education. 50% of US teachers in social studies and middle school level use iCivics in their classroom. Now, does she think it's better than a textbook? She thinks it's more engaging than a textbook and does at least the same level of learning. They did
so the level of learning is the same?
The same, if not stronger, and the engagement level is much stronger. So in that sense, if you ask me, if our kids know more about the government, by the way, when she started the whole project, she said, my problem is that kids don't know the 3 branches of government, but they know the 3 judges of American Idol, right? And she wanted to change that. And I think that if they do know the 3 branches of government, in my book, they're smarter.
Let's take that back to Walaboot.
No, I think, again,
I mean, your opponents are making really the argument, who needs textbooks anymore if their time has come and gone and people have other ways to learn. The learning works. The learning is more appealing, certainly to a generation that didn't spend a life growing up with textbooks. And that's a good thing to not only to surrender to, but to embrace.
no, I mean, I agree. Again, games can teach specific skills, but the question here
But
is...
he didn't say a specific skill. He was talking about a
They're
broad
teaching you
sense
facts, they're teaching you ways of, I think, understanding a specific problem, but that's a specific problem. Does that help you solve other problems, which I think would be a good measure of intelligence, not just, can I solve this specific problem? The game kind of walked me through it, held my hand, and took me through this. Does that make me able to solve other problems is a classic way to think about intelligence, and these games, in no way, we can look at the literature and look at classic measures of IQ and these types of measures, and there's no video game study out there that shows that a video game is even associated with gameplay, not just kind of a pre-post intervention study. So again, I find myself agreeing with Asi on some of these points, I think, but the question I would like to ask is can these games have a more broad benefit? And do you mind if I get back to another point in terms of, you mentioned replication. Again, not all of these studies replicate. I know that from personal kind of experience, but also there are studies in the literature to suggest that these aren't as robust effects as originally made out.
Okay, let's take that to Daphne. Not so much on the point of replication, but the previous point that he was making.
So there are...
In terms of...
I would not defend that we're going to raise IQ as it's been defined in the literature now. I could see ourselves developing another IQ test that is actually showing sensitivity to digital literacy, in a sense video games, so I'm putting back a bigger issue, which is that at the beginning of the 21st century, we know that in order to enter the workforce, you need to have digital literacy. This is not something that we measure very well in terms of our intelligence. It would be a very interesting test. I don't think anyone has put it together. I want to go back to books, what we lose and what we gain, because some of you may know there are some writings by Plato about, surprisingly, writing itself. So in this Greek time, it was actually the oral culture that was dominant. It was what was cherished and revered. And there's a whole debate in Plato, a debate between Phaedrus and Socrates, where Socrates actually laments the fact that the writing system has arrived, that it's going to destroy that oral culture. Guess what? We're going to have to go and look at a book to know what the facts are. And he was perfectly right. We certainly lost some aspects of memories that Elias was mentioning. The declarative memory of these people to be able to argue the precision of their use of vocabulary is something we have entirely lost over these centuries. We have gained other things. We have gained reading and writing. So there's going to be a give and take, and a very interesting give and take we can talk more about, but it's always like a trade-off when new technologies come in.
Elias, not quite, but you were almost being accused of being a Luddite, I think. So what about that argument that, things move on a cycle, a technological cycle, and your complaint about your students needing to use devices to tell them what drug to prescribe rather than having it memorized is so 1980s and not relevant anymore. What about that argument?
I mean, it is. The other thing that we're noticing is that not only are we in the digital sort of realm, but things within this revolution are moving so quickly. So email already feels very antiquated. I can't remember the last time I sent a close friend an email. It's all about texting. And I bring this up to say that things are moving at such a pace that it is hard for the science to keep up with this pace of development. And our brains did not necessarily develop in a way to be able to keep up with these technologies either. I mentioned earlier how they operate on specific pathways in the brain involved in addiction, and maybe this is why they're so difficult to resist. When you're driving and you get a text message and you feel absolutely compelled to check it, even though you know it is not an emergency and you know texting and driving is not a good idea. It's because they're activating certain immediate
I think that's
gratification
just you.
pathways.
I don't think anybody else has ever experienced that. When your opponent, Asi Burak, actually, your partner was saying, look, there's no evidence that these games are increasing IQ, but Asi Burak feels that they're increasing empathy, which is a very, very complex sort of human experience and relationship. What about that?
In my heart, I want to believe that, but I have to be driven by science and by evidence. And we are certainly not at a point where we can make a blanket statement about these video games increasing intelligence or empathy. And making premature statements to that effect can actually be dangerous because it makes it easier for companies to prey on vulnerable populations. And when you're talking about cognition, you're talking especially about a particularly vulnerable subpopulation, which is the elderly and people facing the possibility of Alzheimer's, etc. And to be able to send this message out without having the necessary scientific backing, I think is very counterproductive and is dangerous.
Okay, let's dream a little bit about the future in this debate, and let me put to each side the question: 20 years from now, 25 years from now, and I'll go to you first, Asi. Where should this technology have a place in education and in schools? What's your vision of its proper place?
So, to look at it high level, it's almost like I think that our students today are in a time machine, right? They are going home and engaging in different activities that largely, most of them are more engaging when they go through in the classroom. There is a school in New York that I really recommend anyone here in the audience to read about, called Quest to Learn. And Quest to Learn was designed by a collaboration between teachers and game designers. It's not a school that is only about kids playing games. It's a school that the whole system was designed like the most compelling video game. The idea that you always challenged, but not too much, because otherwise it's frustrating. So it always needs to be one step ahead of you in a way that is engaging, compelling, making you lean in. To me, if I wanted to see the future of education in 20, 25 years, that's the future of education, that the classroom activity is so engaging that kids would love to go to school.
Wally Boot, where do you want to see this technology in 20 years?
I would like to see video games as a supplement. I think this is an important issue. Action video games especially have been promoted to do a lot of things, including curing dyslexia. There's some groups out there that want to push action video game training to improve reading ability, but I think that that's absolutely not the way to go. You want to improve reading ability by teaching reading and the skills that are necessary for reading. I think that there's certainly a way that we can supplement learning with these games that are targeting very directed skills or very directed kind of problem-solving skills and mathematical abilities or these types of things, but if it's very directed, we can't expect any kind of off-the-shelf action video game to improve reading ability.
And Daphne?
So, two responses. The first one is actually great research looking at how to do game for education. There's a whole field called serious game that is getting a really revival by having really understood that the problem was not to translate books to games, but games is a media in of itself. And so there is a lot of development in serious games that are extremely interesting for education. There's a colleague of mine, Diane Schwartz, at the Stanford School of Education, he's a dean there, has been doing also a lot of research looking at games for preparation for learning. There's a game that they've studied in depth for preschooler, a math game, which was Cradle Cradle, where they could show that just education face-to-face corresponded to about 1% improvement in per hour of instruction. With a game, they had 5% of improvement by hours of instruction. This is the kind of thing that Asi is looking at. This is not going to come from any games. I perfectly understand that. The reason why
what do we mean by smarter then, if not raising IQ?
Sorry?
What is smarter?
What is smarter?
Learning, being able to learn, being able to acquire a lot of information. It's actually interesting if you go back to the field of IQ. People that are very high IQ are good learners, but you have many people that are very good learners that don't have high IQ, and those people are very successful in what they do. So for us, really tonight, what we're defending is that to the extent that you can help people learn better and faster, this is how this will make us smarter.
Okay, and then we bring in Elias on this question also, the future of education and gaming.
I would love to see more research being conducted into this question. I think for something that has so radically and drastically changed every aspect of life and every aspect of cognition, the research is light years behind. And as a culture, as a society, we have to insist on more data, on more science. I would love to see us going in a more evidence-based direction.
Okay, I want to go to audience questions now, but before we do, I just want to share the results of the poll we took of you to find out more about you. I was going to be brought a sheet of paper, but I wasn't, and I'm assuming it's just going to come up on the screen. So on the first question, what is your age? Let's see how we all break down. For people who are listening, 17%, less than 18. About a quarter of the room is 18 to 30, about another quarter is 30 to 45, and then 18% 45 to 65, and 11% are older than 65. On the second question, what is your gender? We are, as a group, 51% male, 49% female, almost 50-50. That works out. How frequently do you play video games? Daily, 21%. A few times a week, 18%. A few times a month, 13%. Rarely, 25%. Never, 23%. So that means about half this audience barely ever touches a video game, which is interesting. And what is your preferred gaming platform? 21% console, 22% computer, 23% phone, 10% tablet, 0% other handheld system, 24% none. So almost equal numbers on all of the platforms, including none, those board games and games of canasta that are going on out there. All right, I want to go to audience questions now, and thank you very much for answering those questions. And ma'am, in the red jacket there by the aisle. Yes, thanks. Oh, a microphone's coming for you. I'd like to ask you to stand up, tell us your name. Just first name is good enough, and then your question.
Good evening. My name is Kathleen, and my question is for all four of you. Do you not see a danger that using games for education would cause too much of an emphasis on a reactive learner instead of a proactive learner? And let me just elucidate what I mean by...
Actually, I think it's pretty darn clear.
Okay.
And it was such a perfectly phrased question up to that point. I was thinking, yes. Then you put a comma there. Which side would like? I'm going to have one debater from each side take that question.
I'm happy
Daphne.
to start. So it's an excellent question. I think there's this misconception that games are going to replace the whole educational system. This is not at all what this is about. And actually, there's very good research showing that Games are experience. They're experience that are preparation for learning. You need more. After that, you actually need explanation. And you can get to deeper explanation if your learner has a better understanding of the underlying domain and mechanisms that are in that domain. So that's been shown actually in physics. It has been shown in history teaching. So there's good research. You need that explanation. The Department of Defense has known that for a long time. They probably pioneer in learning through simulation, and they always do simulation and debriefing. And the learning is happening in combination with the two, not just with video games on their own.
The other side like to answer that question? Wally Boo?
No, I think games can provide an engaging way that people can explore a problem. And again, this is teaching very specific skills. I have a colleague, Valerie Shute, who does this game called Newton's Playground, where it teaches you physics skills by allowing you to interact with this virtual reality environment. And I think that's a game that's engaging, and they're not just reacting, they're exploring a space. And again, that's teaching very specific skills that then are related to physics. But I don't fundamentally agree with that notion.
Asi?
To me, the answer to your question is almost the opposite. Because in my mind, most of the learning experiences that our kids have today in school are passive or reactive. They listen to lectures, they read linear textbooks, they have tests that are, a lot of the times, are about wrong and right. There's like a right answer and a wrong answer, while in my mind, most of the true learning happens when you understand that issues are a bit more complex than that. There are trade-offs. There's resource management. There's tough choices to make, and I think that good learning games are about tough choices.
Elias, would you like to join in?
Yeah, I agree with your concern. I think I'd like to make an analogy with therapy, because in therapy there's now a big movement to try to kind of displace the therapist and have people go through therapy programs either through software or remotely. And study after study has shown that patients just don't engage nearly as much when there isn't this active component to the treatment. So I share your concern.
Does anybody see a future where most people are spending most of their time in a game situation and like that idea? Asi, you've got a meaningful grin on your face.
Yeah,
I mean, and I say this, we've done debates about this, about employment in the future and the possibility that there are going to be vast numbers of people who won't have jobs. What will they do all day? And the argument is, well, they'll find meaning, and I'm not being sarcastic, they'll find meaning in games. They'll have tasks, they'll have interaction with people.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was in The Guardian, I think it was a couple of days ago, Harari, the
Yuval
author,
Harari, yeah.
he wrote a story about a useless class that is going to be engaged with virtual reality and video games because they won't have any other thing to do. I'm not crazy about a future like this. I'm more interested in a future where, rather than isolation, it looks more augmented reality, where we are smart enough to add a layer on top of reality that helps us or, gets us encouraged to do things faster and better. I'm less excited about a world where you put the helmet on and you prefer to be there than reality.
And what about the other side? Is that world with the helmet on sort of your nightmare scenario of where we're headting?
I mean, I think our automatic reflex is often to, upgrade to the next operating system and the newest smartphone, et cetera. I think in order to avoid going in that direction more and more, we have to be more conscious of how we interact with technology and try more consciously to achieve some kind of balance.
That's one of those points in which I have a feeling both sides would agree. Right down front here in the plaid shirt. Yes, third row. And a mic's coming down your left-hand side, if you can stand and tell us your name. Thanks. And the question that was asked before the comma, was a model question. That was nice and short and tight, and on topic.
I'll try to keep it short.
Okay.
My name is Jeremy, and I also have a question for all four of you. I wanted to tie this back to this notion of smarter, because I feel like when you read and you study literary fiction, for example, or visual art, I think that does make you smarter in a way. It's exposing you to new ideas, it's inspiring your imagination and your creativity. And I do think there are some game designers out there, like Jason Rohrer, whose work has been featured in the Museum of Modern Art, or Jonathan Blow, who has been called the Thomas Pynchon of gaming. I do think there are certain game designers that are elevating game design to an artistic level. And that may not be the norm
I
just
just
yet,
need you to
but it
zoom
might
into a
be.
question.
So my question is, are you open to the idea that as an artistic experience, games have the potential to make us smarter? And if so, is there a way to demonstrate that empirically?
Let me take it first to the opponents of the idea, Wally Boot.
So yeah, that's a big question. That's an interesting question. And I think art can change us in many fundamental ways. That's not kind of smarter in the way that I think a lot of us have been talking about in kind of the discussion today. But I think that's an important way that these mediums can change us. Yeah, I mean, video games can be art. Video games can be art in the same way that a play or a movie can be art. I don't know if video games are kind of special in that way. I mean, a good book or a good movie can do the same thing. But I wouldn't argue with the fact that people enjoy video games. They provide something to them that's valuable and meaningful. Does that kind of translate to making them smarter in the way that I think a lot of other people might define smart? I don't think that that's the case, but it can provide a valuable experience.
Okay, and Daphne, you want to take that on?
Yeah, so actually, as you probably know, the MoMA recently decided to curate video games as piece of arts. And so if you go to the MoMA, there's a whole exhibit. I think there are the Smithsonian also that recently did a retrospective on the history of video games. There's definitively video game as a form of art that is being recognized. So if you think that going to the museum, going to the Met, looking at the pyramids, looking at a Picasso makes you smarter, video games have exactly that same potential.
Okay. In the green shirt. Yep. If you could stand up, thanks.
Hi, my question is to the
Could
side.
you tell us your name also, please?
Oh, my name's John. And my question is to this side for the motion. Is cognitive development in the context of video games a zero-sum quantity in the sense that if you identify one positive effect, have you looked for or identified a corresponding deleterious effect?
What an interesting question. That's for you, Daphne.
So yeah, thanks for asking. There is two different levels. One is, as Elias was saying, research is very, very slow. I presented for you 17 years of research. It took 17 years to have those guys acknowledge, yes, that research is partly solid, right? They wouldn't have done that. Like we published a paper in Nature in 2003. I would not have given a TED talk in 2003. We all know that research has to be replicated, that it's really a slow process. So right now there's an experiment of Nature that actually the US has accepted to do, which is to put very, very young kids on tablets. This is not just video games, this is all kind of different technology. We have no idea, none, what are the impact on the developmental trajectory of those children. We have decided it was okay. Like, this is a question, we need funding, we need big funding, we need groups of researchers coming together to accelerate that research, because it's a huge worry for people like Elias, Wally, and I, in people that are in science. Now, with the video games we have been studying, they all happen to have violence. So we actually didn't run training studies in children, but we go in schools, and that's actually something important for parents out here. And we use our tests on these school children. And we ask the parents, what are the video game habits of the kid? But we also ask the kid, what are your video game habits? And guess what? They don't line up. So one recommendation for those of you parents of young children is talk to your children. Even play with them. You'll see whether they play at your friend's house, because you'll see their level. and begin to address also the type of problems that Elias was mentioning. Like, too much playing can be debilitating. There's really a need for education. One last word, there's a great program right now in Geneva which is being launched because a number of us have actually advocated for giving digital literacy class in schools from very early on, and actually getting the kids to understand what are all these different technology, what they do to their brain and behavior, and what are the danger of it. And I think we really need that in schools.
And I'm just interrupting because I want to get back to the question, which was, which of you would like to take this? The question is, are the skills that are developed as a result of gaming that have been measured paid for at the cost of the loss of some other skill, cognitive skill? Wally Boot, do we know?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're kind of living that experiment right now. We don't know, but I'd like to say time is a zero-sum game. If you're using that time for a video game, you're not using it for something else. So there are going to be costs that if you think, for example, that action video games might improve, or any type of video game might improve reading ability or might improve working memory so that people with ADHD, children with ADHD can concentrate better in schools, and they're playing those video games, they're not doing other things that could potentially be more beneficial for them.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Right down in the front here. And the mic's coming down the left-hand side.
Hi, my name is Kathleen, too. And my question is for those against the motion, specifically on the subject of, I guess a lot of this has come down to cognitive ability versus as a learning supplement. And to the question of cognitive ability, in your study about attention and people's fixating on things or not being able to focus, if these things make them more engaged, my question is the relationship between engagement and information retention and brain plasticity, and whether there's any relationship possible in that for the emotion.
Thanks. Elias?
Well, I mean, when you look at rates of attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder and rates of stimulant prescriptions that I mentioned earlier, there is a correlation between that and the amount of time that kids especially spend playing video games. But we don't know how some video games can indeed maybe help in cases of attention deficit. I mean, it could be that as a result of, promoting engagement, then in some cases they can help ADHD, but that's not what the bulk of the research shows. And the connection with ADHD is one that has been tested across cultures and age groups and genders. So it's pretty established. But there are cases and reports of particular games helping in some cases of inattention. But more research is needed. I mean, can't make any conclusions based on what we know at this
Response from the other side, very briefly?
Yeah, so
Daphne.
there is evidence that one of the gateway to brain plasticity and learning is this type of attentional control we have been actually studying. Not only for obvious reason. Right now you have the choice of paying attention to me and learn from me, but you could pay attention to your neighbor and whatever they're doing, and then you wouldn't actually learn from me, right? But also because attentional control is linked to the release of a variety of neurotransmitters that have been shown in animal studies to facilitate learning and brain plasticity. Now that's one answer. The answer about video game is, as I told you, not all video game boost attentional control, that's for sure. And it's even more complicated than that. The same video game may boost the attentional control of Jim, but will not boost the attentional control of Joe that actually has ADD, ADHD. So we know from our work that those video games that boost attentional control in normal, healthy individuals don't work in ADD, ADHD individuals. And that's actually why we're working on at Achille Interactive. We know why. People that have ADD, ADHD get into those games and they don't play in a proactive fashion. They always play in a reactive fashion. They spray bullets all over. They're having fun, but they don't plan ahead. So you need to design a game that actually forces the player to plan ahead. It's actually doable, but again, it comes back to design. There's nothing magical about video games. It's going to be a specific problem and a specific design solution given what you want them to learn.
And Asi, are you, after hearing these arguments, have you changed your position at all? Or?
No, I haven't changed my position. I do see a tension between, this side, our side, trying to claim that, there are strong case studies, and I could name many more that, some of them, by the way, go to clinical trials and done clinical trials, so I don't think it's accurate that there's none. But these would be almost like pioneering examples. You know, these would be exemplars. And I think that we need to understand the context. The context is it's a young medium, very young medium. Movies have developed for decades. TV, same thing, and not to mention books. We're talking about a very young medium in terms of research, but also in terms of design. But to me, the fact that we can start to identify those very, very strong pioneering examples, some of them, like the Sandra Day O'Connor story, are in the real world, to me, that shows the promise, because with evolution, we can just become more sophisticated.
And I'll give Elias the last word. Your opponent saying he's excited about the promise. And your response is?
I want to be excited about the promise. The evidence so far, 20 years into the digital revolution, is not very encouraging, and I hate to say that.
And that concludes round 2 of this Intelligence Squared US debate, where our motion is video games will make us smarter. And now we move on to round 3. Round 3, brief closing statements by each debater in turn. Immediately after that, you will vote a second time. The motion again, video games will make us smarter. Here, making her closing statement in support of the motion, Daphne Bavalier, Professor of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at the University of Geneva.
So I'd like to go back to a personal story. I'm the mom of 3 children. Actually, they are young adults now. And when they were actually developing in adolescence, I really had the prototypical gender stereotype at home, with my son playing action video games and strategy games, and my 2 daughters being much more into texting, into new technologies like, you know, social media, and a lot of media multitasking, meaning that you check your Facebook page, you do your Instagram, you text at the same time, and you do your math homework. Believe it or not, I've always fought only my girls, based on what I know. First, because we shouldn't mix all technologies. There is definitively research coming out suggesting that multimedia tasking, so switching between different media, which, by the way, Steve Jobs sold to us beautifully as you're going to be more productive, is linked to deficit in attention and attentional control. The other reason why I also been fighting my girls is that, and wondering, like, you know, how can I do better, is that there is really this big offer for boys and video games that are potential enhancers of things like, for example, spatial cognition, which is very good for science and technology. And when you look at the video games that girls are attracted to, there are very few games that have those kinds of cognitive benefits. They are much more on the social side. We are glad there are social games, but we would love to see a better ecosystem of games that are preparation for learning in all different domains, for all different gender, for all different background and ethnicity. We are really pushing here and asking you to vote yes for the motion that video games will make us smarter, in the sense that video games really have amazing learning power. We need to produce those video games. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daphne Bavalier. The motion again, video games will make us smarter. Here, making his closing statement against the motion, Wally Boot, Professor of Psychology at Florida State University.
So I'd like to make the case that the evidence simply isn't there yet. We don't have the studies with the right control groups, with the right methods, with the right statistical approaches to show us that action video games or any other types of video games can really make us smarter or improve general cognitive abilities. These effects don't always replicate. I'd like to kind of make that point again. And also that when you look at meta-analyses, kind of large kind of overviews of studies, oftentimes when you correct for publication bias and other types of methodological flaws, these are fairly small effects that we're seeing. So those are that's one thing I want to make kind of clear. But also, I'd like to talk a little bit more about opportunity cost, which I think is really, really important. If we think about, for example, your aging parent or a grandparent or just an aging friend trying to improve cognitive abilities, trying to improve their cognition, there's going to be an opportunity cost. they're going to be playing games, and if these games aren't improving their cognition, then they're not doing other things. They're not spending time with their children or grandchildren. They're not engaging with their community. I think there are costs there. So, and they're not doing other things that might be more better for their cognition, might be better for their cognition, such as aerobic exercise or any other of these types of things that I think have a lot more evidence for them. Aerobic exercise, you can go all the way from the mouse model all the way to the human model. Intervention studies for the animal models, you can open up the brain, you can see neuroplasticity, you can see new capillary beds and all these other types of things. We're not there yet for action video games or any other type of video games where we have that level of evidence that we can trace what is the active ingredient that's causing all these changes, that's causing such unbelievable effects. So I ask that you consider both the general weakness, I think, of the evidence in the video game literature right now, but also the consequences if we recommend these things too soon, if we recommend these prematurely for interventions for reading, cognitive aging, and other types of issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali Boot. And the motion again, video games will make us smarter. And here making his closing statement in support of the motion, Asi Burak, chairman of Games for Change and CEO of PowerPlay.
Thank you. So, as you probably saw through the debate, in my personal view, there is an answer to the question, will video games make us smarter? And I would even go beyond that from the cases that I've seen, both in practice and research. Games could do other things as well if they're well designed and designed for a purpose. They could make us smarter. In some cases, they could even make us healthier. They can help us learn about the world and broaden our horizons. Again, well-designed and for a purpose, not every game. And as you saw, Daphne and I will be the last ones to say that there are no negative outcomes and we don't need to address them. And this is my main point. If there's one takeaway that I want you to go home with, is that point of how do we do a better job as parents, educators, players, to understand this medium. Because what is a fact that I'm sure you won't be arguing about is that it is a super powerful industry. It's about to cross the threshold of $100 billion worldwide, which means that it's bigger than the music industry and the film industry combined. Time of play on a weekly basis, worldwide, 7 billion hours, okay? So to my colleagues, I would say, rather than fight this amazing phenomena, join it in the sense that your expertise, but it's serious, your expertise and our expertise could help all the people in the audience and all the people that will interact with understand how to deal with it better rather than ban it or I mean, it's not going to go away. It's just going to grow stronger. So, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to vote yes for the motion. I want you to say with us, the video games will make us smarter, but also that we need to be smarter about video games. Thank you.
Thank you, Asi Burak. And that is the motion. Video games will make us smarter. Here making his closing statement against the motion, Elias Aboujaoude, professor of psychiatry at Stanford Medical School.
The best-selling video games of 2016 had titles like Grand Theft Auto, Final Fantasy, and Infinite Warfare. It's hard to imagine how playing these games hours upon hours has raised our average IQ. On the other hand, these games, I think like the internet at large, can nurture some rather negative personality elements, aggression, narcissism, impulsivity being some examples. There's evidence about violent video games leading to downstream offline future violence, and for evidence on how online narcissism and impulsivity can lead to offline narcissism and impulsivity, you can find examples from both sides of the aisle from the last election. It's not possible to turn the clock back on technology. This is not something that is feasible nor advisable. Yet some of us are trying to achieve some kind of balance between our online and our offline lives. But in trying to achieve that balance, we're faced by two formidable obstacles. The first obstacle we can do nothing about, and it has to do with how our brains are wired. And they're not wired necessarily in a way that makes us able to resist these technologies and to take them in small doses only. But the other obstacle is huge industry interests and huge marketing campaigns. They're trying to convince us that these technologies are actually making us smarter, they're good for us, we should embrace them even more. I'd like to end by bringing up a case of a patient I saw a couple of weeks ago. I'll call him Jeff, a 21-year-old who achieved one of the highest possible scores on a shoot-'em-up game. However, he was so consumed by this game that he was failing 3 of his classes. I think the least helpful intervention I can make, the least compassionate statement maybe, is to tell him that I know you're failing, but your processing speed is off the charts. I think it would be the wrong message to send him, and I think it would be the wrong message to send the culture at large. So I urge you to vote no on the motion. I think it's the most intelligent thing to do.
Thank you, Elias Aboujaoude. And that concludes round 3 of this Intelligence Squared US debate, where the motion is video games will make us smarter. And now it's time to learn which side you feel has argued the best. I want to ask you to go again to the keypads at your seat and vote as you did in the beginning. Video games will make us smarter. If you agree with this motion, push number 1. If you disagree, push number 2. If you remain or became undecided, push number 3. Okay, while we're doing that, I want to point out that there was a lot of high risk of agreement between the 4 of you tonight. And the reason for that is that you were all willing to concede well-made points by the other side. And I have to say that at Intelligence Squared, we respect that impulse. It wasn't win at all costs. And if your opponent said something you respected, you acknowledged it. So I want to congratulate you for that and for the whole style in which you brought this. I did notice that when Daphne was giving parents advice on how to sort of keep an eye on what their kids are gaming, that there are a lot of kids in the audience, and they were all doing like a lot of that. But I think that this was a really interesting debate, in fact, from all sides for parents, and I thank you for that. And we have an unusual number of kids tonight, so I hope that you enjoyed it. And I noticed that almost none of you were texting throughout the evening as well. So. I want to let you know a few things about IQ2. First of all, one of the most important things that I say at the end of every debate, especially to the newcomers, is that Intelligence Squared US is a philanthropic activity. We know that most of you bought tickets to get in here, and we appreciate that, but the ticket price covers only a fraction of the cost of putting on one of these debates. And we, in fact, we set them off into the wild basically for free. We give it away. The podcast is a free product, and it's used now, we know, in public schools and other schools across the country to teach debate, which we think is a key to developing critical thinking, critical reasoning. It's kind of a game played between 2 sides. But all that said, we would really appreciate it if you're moved to support this, to keep it going, to help us grow, which is definitely our plan. You can go to our website and at iq2us.org, but you can also text using your phone. If you text the word debate to the number 797979, you'll get a link and you can make a contribution. And with something that we would really, really appreciate, because we want to keep this, we are going, I'm not going to say we want to keep it going, we want to get it bigger and go to more places and do more debates. And speaking of more debates, we have one more coming up in this season, not in New York though, we're going to be in San Francisco in partnership with the National Constitution Center. And we're going to be looking at a debate that examines the challenges faced by tech companies when governments are demanding customer data. It's a legal statutory issue, a constitutional issue, and it's very, very rich, and it's very, very relevant. It covers something going on right now. Our debaters will include Stuart Baker, who is a former general counsel to the NSA, John Yoo, who is a professor at Berkeley Law and a former Justice Department attorney, Catherine Crump, who's also a Berkeley Law professor and a former ACLU attorney, and Michael Chertoff, who is the former Secretary of Homeland Security and has debated with us a few times and is just spectacular in debate. If you're listening via podcast and you're that side of the country, you can get tickets to that now through our website. And also, we're going to be back, of course, here in New York in the fall, so please be sure to sign up for our mailing list for all of our latest updates. Again, I did mention this in the beginning. There are lots of ways to follow and catch our debates. We've now done more than 140 debates, I think, and 136. Somebody just told me in my ear, and they're all available, and most of them are still relevant. A few, a very, very small number, were outdated by events. Some of them got even better because of events. They're available via our app, which you can get through the Apple Store or the Google Play Store, and on Apple TV and on Roku. I want to say one more thing before I read the results. I'm not going to bring her to the stage, but since Intelligence Squared was founded in 2006, one of the key members of our team, who has been, I would say, the most superior critical thinker, who helps us work through what our issues are going to be, to read through the literature, to help us figure out where the fault lines are, to figure out what's relevant, is a colleague of ours named Chris Kamikawa. And she has decided to move on after this debate, after 11 seasons with us. And so she's backstage blushing and will not be pulled out. But if you could just let her know that we really appreciate everything she's done. Okay, so the results are all in now. The motion is this: video games will make us smarter, reminding you that it's the difference between the first vote of the evening when you first arrived and the vote that you cast after hearing all the arguments. It's the difference that chooses the winner, the number whose goes up, the team whose numbers go up the most. Let's look at the results. Before you heard the arguments, 40% of you agreed with the motion that video games will make us smarter. 23% of you disagreed with that. A large 37% were undecided. Let's look at the second vote. In the second vote, the team arguing for the motion, their vote went from 40% to 53%. They picked up 13 percentage points. That is the number to beat. Let's see how the team arguing against them did. Their first vote was 23%. Their second vote was 32%. They picked up 9 percentage points, but it's not enough to win. The victory goes, the win goes to the team arguing for the motion, video games will make us smarter. Congratulations to them. Thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US. We'll see you next time.